Hello and welcome to this week's Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly look at the news agenda. I'm joined, as ever, by Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our senior fellow, broadcaster and historian, and Amy Gallagher from Stand Up to Woke, the lady behind Stand Up to Woke. Very pleased she's joining us this week. Now, did you know that apparently in the Middle Ages, Black women were far more prone to die from the bubonic plague in London? No, I didn't either, but that's the latest bit of nonsense we're going to be talking about from the BBC this week. We're also going to be discussing a little bit the new Argentinian president who's made quite a splash. His name is Javier Milei. And also we're going to be finding out if one of the Roman emperors truly was trans, as again is being claimed by our good friend at the BBC. But first of all, a far more serious subject, you might say. You might remember about 8 years ago that there was a Somalian who was being deported, Somalian rapist being deported, and he was stopped from being deported by the actions of passengers on the plane at that time. Well, here we are 8 years later, and after many different appeals and human rights lawyers and all the rest of it, he's finally being deported back to Somalia. This is an interesting case, isn't it, Amy? Also because the BBC have got involved in a very particular and very sort of, incorrect way, it seems to me.
Yeah, as we've recently found out. So, as you said, this is a story of an asylum seeker who came to the UK, I think in 2008, and went on to commit a very brutal gang rape of a 16-year-old. And then he served his sentence, and then as he came out, there was quite a long legal process to deport him, which resulted in about 24 tribunals, actually. And then eventually the outcome was that he was to be deported. And when security staff were escorting him onto the plane, as you said, there was a kind of passengers were, he sort of feigned health concerns, and he started screaming and he started saying they're separating me from my family and so on. And all the rather naive passengers on the plane said, this is outrageous, this is a human rights abuse and so on. So he was then removed, and that further delayed his deportation. And it's been a lengthy process from 2018 to now for him to be deported. We've just found out recently that he was deported in August of this year. It's been 3 months. We've only just found about this now because he was given 3 months of anonymity. So the press weren't allowed to talk about it until now. And a whole host of things have come to light since then, one of which is, as you say, that a BBC editor was presented evidence to the tribunal court, essentially claiming that he shouldn't be deported. I don't quite know what that evidence is, if it's an expert witness testimony or what.
I think it is.
It is. It seems rather bizarre.
It's Mary Harper.
Right, yes. Yeah.
She is the Africa editor.
Yeah, that's right. And alongside that, we've also seen that after he was deported back to Somalia, he's received about 3 months worth of taxpayers' money to fund a hotel and food and mental health support and so on. So all these things are coming to light, and it's just one of those stories where you couldn't make it up. It's got so many aspects to it that kind of seem to summarise everything that we sort of talk about on this programme, immigration. And this all happened, of course, under Tory government. And it's quite extraordinary that the BBC was somehow roped in to present a favourable account of this rapist. It's you couldn't make it up. It's.
I think wasn't this Rafe, that she actually argued that he would be in danger? Wasn't that the thing if he went back to Somalia? I mean, whatever it is, the inclusion of this journalist surely breaks some form of regulation with the BBC, doesn't it?
Yeah, she was saying that if he went back there because he had raped a 16-year-old girl, that he'd be subject to Sharia law. Some people might say, well, that's a good thing, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. But yeah, I mean, the key thing here is, the BBC seems to be trying its hardest to be its own worst enemy here, just at the moment when everybody seems to be questioning its claims to impartiality, and we've had big question marks hanging over its coverage, for example, of events in Israel and Palestine. Now we get this clear, blatant breach of its impartiality guidelines. We have a woman, Mary Harper, who has been severely reprimanded by the tribunals for the fact that she wasn't fully briefed on reading the evidence, which was clear from her testimony, and then she was caught up on that fact, and that it was clear that she wasn't being objective in her application of her expert opinion on all of this. And when you have a tribunal, which is not known for being necessarily very conservative or right-wing, pulling up somebody for not being objective and for not actually doing enough research, you do realize that these people are actually simply advancing their own agenda and are speaking from a very partisan position, which calls into confidence everything that they put out. Now, everything that she utters on the BBC in her capacity as senior editor for Africa will be called into question. And this is an insidious development which we're seeing on an increasing number of levels in the BBC, to such a point now that I think, you would like there to be another investigational commission, but nothing ever seems to happen about it. We've got this Director General, Tim Davey, who was supposed to get all of this into order, and yet things seem to be as bad as they ever were.
Yes, this is a particularly bad one in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's worth saying that this man has been quite open about the fact that he's gaming the system. In 20,
really?
Yes, yeah. Oh, he said I'm one step ahead of immigration officers. He's said that. And in 2020, when he was about to have his tribunal to determine whether he should be deported or not, a video emerged of terrorists saying we're going to kill him, and this delayed his deportation, and it turned out to be a fake that he'd created himself. And they had to get in some terror experts to determine that it was a fake. And he's made claims about him being at risk of modern slavery and having PTSD and so on. And of course, all the left-wing lawyers and human rights lawyers have supported him. And as I said, he's openly gaming the system, and they still seem to be supporting him. And I don't understand what's going on in the mind of this BBC woman.
But it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? That because also actually you mentioned about the current coverage of the situation, the Gaza situation. And Jeremy Bowen and some of his reporting has just been unbelievable. About
somebody who was once so trusted. My mother always used to hold him up. Since the 1980s, I used to respect this man for his coverage of things. But also it was the case with when the hospital was set on fire as well. We saw that journalist. But we've had 13 years of Tory government. We had under Dominic Raab at least an attempt to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a Bill of Rights that would actually restrict your fundamental freedoms to the core fundamental freedoms, and get rid of all these spurious arguments that are put forward on the right to life and so forth, which allow corrupt or disingenuous lawyers to abuse the legal system and allow people like this chap to game the system. But of course, one has to ask, are things going to get any better under the next government? I don't think so.
No, I would have thought, actually, apparently I think it's the whole thing has cost £1 million.
Yeah,
£1 million.
I know,
right?
it's extraordinary, yeah.
And also, as you say, he's been given a luxury hotel and a course of therapy.
Yeah.
All on taxpayers' money. I mean, it's been said before, but a country that wants to survive does not behave in this way, does it?
No, it's favouring the perpetrator over the victim. We've always we never hear about the victim. There's a 16-year-old girl that went through hell, and as she, I assume she's not been given the amount of time, money, energy that this man has, and that it reminds me of the grooming gang scandal a little bit.
Yeah.
It's got a sort of flavour of that about it. It's just outrageous that she was having to witness all this, in terms of the person that abused her, and no fault. All these people that, no fault is given to her, but what she's gone through, and
and how she must feel seeing attack her in the media constantly.
Yeah.
Apparently, one of the people, because he was part of a gang rape, one of the other people who took part joined ISIS after.
Right.
I mean, this is just about got it all, hasn't it?
Including the useful idiots on the plane.
Well,
yes.
I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
None of this would have happened. These useful idiots. I remember very clearly. Do you remember the actual footage?
Yeah.
Of them? And they were basically the Home Office guys, I imagine, were trying to get him off the plane. They either were motivated by kind of greed in that they wanted to get on their holiday and they were sick of this, right? That's to give it actually a good complexion, really. The rest of it, though, was virtue signaling.
Absolutely.
And ignorance, wasn't it? These people flying to the defense of this guy. To me, that they're the ones most at fault in this situation.
Yeah, along with Mary Harper, I mean, the government actually had a plan to charter a plane to take him back, and she put the kibosh on that, giving her expert opinion by saying that he would be regarded as a spy back home if he arrived on a plane chartered by, and as was quite rightly said by the tribunal in their excoriating remarks on this, if you wanted to, the worst thing you could do for a spy was send them back on a chartered plane by the British government. I mean, it's a complete nonsense, this alleged expert opinion of hers.
No, it is, as we say, it's got just about everything in it, that case. While we're on the BBC, actually, because they're not covering themselves in glory at all at the moment, they came out with what some people call peak craziness with woke recently. And this is a story which emanated actually from the the Museum of London, should I say. And this was a story which aimed to show that structural racism in medieval Britain meant that black women in London were far more likely to die of the plague. Had you come across this before?
Well, now we know why it's called the Black Death, don't we? Quite clearly. I mean, that's obviously... But I mean, I think that's how basic it's got. I bet you somebody at the Museum of London said, Black Death, I wonder, let's have a look at this. You know, I bet you that's actually the sort of mentality that we're dealing with on such a basic level. I mean, the story is a complete nonsense. I mean, what you've had one of the academics saying that London, that at this time of its history, this was a black London. I mean, give me a break. We don't actually know for certain whether the skeletons, there were skeletons essentially, 145 skeletons from 3 separate burial pits were exhumed, but only 45 of them were actually found to have been buried with the Black Death, with the plague. Some of the skeletons actually weren't people who died of the plague, but may have been black. But that may, there's a lot of stretching and a lot of legwork. I mean, it's very difficult to actually identify whether these actually do come from sub-Saharan Africa at all. It's highly suspect, the entire thing. But again, it's all done. There is this obsession. Who on earth in their right mind thinks that it's a worthwhile area of study to look at race and the Black Death? I mean, it just shows you the level of obsession. It's pathological almost in these people today to try to link everything and to try to divide things. What actually an earlier study had shown was that those bodies that actually may have been black were buried with great respect and dignity, and that there was no evidence at all of any mistreatment or maltreatment. So for that very tiny percentage of the population that may have been black, I mean, we're talking infinitely small numbers, there's no evidence actually of racism being in place there. And yet the conclusion of this study is that the high proportion of deaths was because of racism.
But don't you think that this is, it's here we are, we're being reasonable and applying reason to it. But the point is, in a way, you're talking about something that is unreasonable, and it's not an historical discovery. The point of it is to say, look, Britain was always a nation of immigrants. London was built by migrants. What you've been told for years and years is wrong. That is what is the motive behind this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Black Plague, as I understand it, it killed about a third of Londoners. So it killed a very large amount of London. And if black people were disproportionately affected, so what? What does
how
that
many
prove?
are we talking
I
about?
know.
We're talking about tiny numbers.
I know, it's so ridiculous. But even so, it doesn't matter. What would that... I mean, it's the same, I don't know if they're trying to put the argument that was made about COVID and sort of apply that to the Black Plague. But there was an argument that black people were more disproportionately affected by the COVID virus because they lacked vitamin B. What does that prove? I mean, what sort of political point are you making with that?
But they're also more likely to live in multi-occupancy dwellings, right? That's the real issue there. It's about poverty and other things, and it's not to do with race and ethnicity necessarily. But it's this attempt to force onto the past the politics of today and the tensions of today, and I think it's deeply insidious. But you're quite right, Peter. As I said before, civilizations and cultures are always based on foundational myths. Now, London's foundational myth was always that it was founded by Brutus of Troy after defeating the giants Gog and Magog, and that linked London to the classical world. And that was a wonderfully inspiring myth for centuries. Now what we have is this attempt to create this new myth by Sadiq Khan saying London was built by immigrants. The new myth is that this has always been a multicultural, multiracial society, and that actually there's no true value in Britishness or in Englishness or in real Londoners. It's an insult to those generations who built St Paul's Cathedral and the Tower of London and the Palace of Westminster. But the fact is, this is this new ideology that's being put forward.
Actually, it's quite interesting. We're going to go off the point of it. He put out another message this week, Sadiq Khan, where basically, obviously, I think it must have been put out in the aftermath of all those demonstrations we've been seeing, more or less saying, if you live in London, wherever you are from, you are a Londoner. Right now, that's not my definition actually of a city. I'm sure that, you know,
So much for Bow Bells. Yes.
well, exactly. But if you,
So if
if
you're a
if any of
tourist, you're a
us-
Londoner.
If any of us were to go and work and live in Paris for 5 years, would you refer to yourself as a Parisian?
Well, if someone from East Cheap went to live in Tokyo, nobody would say you're Japanese
Yes.
or you're a
Yes.
Tokian or Tokyoite, whatever the name
No,
is.
they would have no trouble with it. But anyway, but the point is, it is about that, isn't it? It's about sort of delegitimizing, you know, our past, actually. Speaking of which, Museum of London, I have to make this point. Museum of London, which is now, I'm not sure, you can tell me whether it has opened or not, but
No.
it's got a new base in Smithfield Meat Market.
Several
as
years
well.
away, but-
Yeah. But I remember when I last went to the Museum of London, which is in the Barbican, it struck me, and that's before we were that aware, it was about the wokest of any museum I can imagine. And I think that one of the reasons they might be doing this is because London is now majority minority.
That's absolutely the case. Well, I mean, I went to the Imperial War Museum recently and had much the same experience. And this was a museum I loved to go to as a child. And I loved the World War I and Blitz experience and the tanks and planes. Half of that has now gone. I mean, it's bereft of all that. What you do have is you have a whole section on refugees and on the UN, and it's completely changed its focus and is clearly advancing a very different agenda to the one which was to celebrate, not celebrate, but to commemorate the wars of the past. Many of those wars aren't actually even visible there now.
It should be worth saying that Kemi Badenoch did raise this story.
Yes, I saw something about, what did she say?
Well, she was saying it's misinformation, it's wrong, it's, you know, illiterate and so on. And there was a Twitter community note saying actually this is wrong, what they're saying.
Yeah.
And then she said something about I'm going to write to them to tell them that it's wrong. But you do sort of think, you know, you're the one in power
Yes,
here,
yes.
you know, and it feels like they're the opposition. It's like the BBC have the power and the Conservative government are just sort of
Pointing it out.
And you think,
Yes,
hang on a minute,
yes.
where's the power dynamic here?
I mean, she
It's-
was
it's-
brought on board the Board of Governors of the British Museum, I think. But that's the thing, the left are the masters of occupying the levers of power in all of these institutions. Whether it's university departments or whether it's galleries and museums, they get their people into power. That's what Tony Blair did so effectively.
Yes.
And the big disgrace, the big tragedy of the last 13 years is that we weren't able to put into positions of power people who actually had a deep and abiding respect for the history of this country.
Actually, one thing, sorry, we're going all over the place because these are such interesting topics, actually, but one worth looking out for is David Starkey recently did a lecture that is on his channel, I think, basically saying we have got to simply undo every Blairite act. If you want to save, but that's his view, you've just simply got to literally reverse everything that happened under Blair.
Reverse the long march through the institutions,
Yeah.
reverse the back of the envelope,
Mass
constitutional changes that he brought into effect, reverse mass immigration, all of these things. Absolutely right.
Well, we'll stay on museums because there's one that's sort of quite funny. I know you've been practicing the name. I know, Rafe, but apparently there is now also an emperor who's trans. Is that right?
Yes. Well, this is the Emperor Elagabalus, who was a very short-lived emperor. It was about 4 years, but he was so despotic and demonic that he was given short shrift shortly after coming to power, as bad as Caligula and Nero in terms of his treatment of people. But now this Museum of North Hertfordshire has found a coin, and on the basis of this coin they are using she/her pronouns for this emperor, using as evidence a history written by his successor. But the successor to this chap was, an enemy of this chap, in the way that she would actually denigrate and
Like
ridicule
Richard III.
somebody,
Yeah.
exactly like Shakespeare did with Richard III, is to portray them in a very unflattering light. And there was no way more unflattering to portray someone than to say that they were a woman back in Roman times. That's the evidence. I mean, the most we could possibly say about this person was that he was closer to Julian Clary or Hinge and Brackett than he was to a trans person. And actually, there's some validity to talking about that, because this seems to be yet another example of the radical trans movement trying to erase gay history. There are very many people in gay history now who you could easily see the trans community trying to say, oh, well, actually they're one of ours. And of course we see this in everyday life, where people who may be very effeminate boys or very masculine tomboyish girls normally would end up being lesbian or gay, and now are being directed by social services, by the schools and parents or other, down these paths to changing their gender and their sex.
Exactly. I mean, and also the psychotherapy industry is really kind of into this as well, isn't it? I mean, you're making a program for us at the moment, actually, aren't you, about this very thing?
Yeah, well, this whole decision to call this emperor by new pronouns was done after consultation with Stonewall. Obviously, known for their great historical scholarship, which is obviously Stonewall work have sort of got into every kind of institution. I mean, that's the whole issue with transgenderism in the Tavistock. It was Stonewall having an influence and mermaids having influence. So they seem to be able to work their way into every institution and somehow take over. They have no expertise or knowledge of medicine or history. They're an activist organisation, and yet somehow they seem to be able to take power.
That's exactly right. And remember, this also just follows on from stories we had last year, where Elizabeth I was said to be non-binary, presumably because she said, I have the heart and stomach of a woman, the body of a king, heart and stomach of a king. And also Joan of Arc, they had a whole play about her being non-binary, which of course annoyed feminists, tremendously too. And don't forget, of course, the other emperor, Lucius Septimus Severus, who was told, we were told he was black just because he came from the Middle East, who was clearly not sub-Saharan African. So there's this is a complete agenda to try to make identity politics relevant to the past, when actually those labels they didn't exist actually.
I thought that Stonewall were kind of in retreat. I mean, maybe I'm being naive. They were really under the hammer, weren't they, a few months ago? I thought they were
Well, they're still going, obviously, but they've taken a few knocks, but they're still...
But apparently this emperor, do you think he saw us, whatever his name was, he was apparently just, as you say, just very effeminate. I mean, but then so was Caligula. I mean, anyone who's watched I, Claudius, with John Hurt, he was just very fey.
The issue of this is that the whole trans ideology, they're trying to argue that trans is something you're born with, which has not been proven, but you have this inner gender mismatch to your body or whatever. So which is why they're so aggressive on claiming children to be trans, because if you're saying you're born with it, then you can detect it in a 3-year-old, 4-year-old and so on. But that also applies to history. So they say, well, if this is a thing you're born with, then there must be people throughout history that have been born with this. So this is why the ideology is so aggressive in going throughout history and trying to pick people up to prove that they're right. And, as you were saying, you could go, I mean, why stop at the Roman emperor? I was in the National Gallery not long ago, and I was thinking, I joked to someone I was with there that I was looking at the sort of statesmen of the Georgian era with their big long wigs and their sort of flouncy kind of clothes and their stockings. And I was saying, somebody at some point is going to argue that King George I was gender fluid, and then not long after you hear that, this emperor's trans, and you can't make it up. It's just applying, this whole idea of identity is a very modern thing. And we can't even, currently, we can't even agree what trans even means. So the idea that you could somehow apply that to a civilization over 1,000 years ago is just crazy. It doesn't even...
Well, it requires a society that is basically ignorant, doesn't it? And it requires one that's basically lost its marbles, its Elgin marbles, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting point, because we had an article from the Times last week which revealed that Keir Starmer has been having private discussions with the Greeks about the return of the Elgin marbles, but he had a vow of silence over it because he didn't want to he didn't want to scare centrist voters who may vote for him at the next election. But that sort of gives you an inkling of what may be happening or what may come to pass following the next election.
Tony, we haven't actually, for a long time on this show, we haven't picked up these kind of like you couldn't make it up type stories, have we? I mean, because there have been things going on outside, which are still going on, I might add, which have obviously diverted quite rightly our attention. But somebody who wouldn't, I imagine, have any truck with any of this is the new president-elect of Argentina, and his name is Javier Milei. He sort of has caused, didn't he, a bit of a fuss because he's an extraordinary manner, you know, which was very, shall we say, unpresidential. However, he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and well, I for one thought he was extremely lucid. Anyway, we're going to have a quick look at a clip so you know who we're talking about. This was him being interviewed by Tucker Carlson for X or Twitter.
Para eso hay que estar preparado y hay que dar la batalla cultural día a día y que hay que tener cuidado porque ellos no tienen problema en meterse adentro del Estado y aplicar las técnicas de Gramsci, seduciendo a artistas, seduciendo, o sea, la cultura, seduciendo a los medios de comunicación o metiéndose en los contenidos de la educación. Hay que tener mucho cuidado, hay que cortarles el financiamiento y hay que hacerlos competir a la par.
I don't know what you make of it, but what I looked at that and I just thought, you know, the idea that we would have a leader here who actually even could articulate this kind of thing in such a clear-minded way was inconceivable, actually.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I thought the way he diagnosed the problem of the far left was very spot on, actually. And I mean, I don't profess to know enough about Argentinian politics, but you could take what he said and just map it onto the UK or the US in terms of that problem. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know that we could ever have someone like that here. I mean, as I understand it, his election was in response to extreme economic crisis and hyperinflation, and maybe it's got to get that bad in the area of economics rather than culture that people vote for someone like this, and maybe we're not there yet. But yeah, I can't imagine someone speaking like that here, but it's interesting to see someone with such radical. Well, he's a libertarian, isn't he?
Yes, it was 143% inflation, rate of inflation.
It's gone up from about 40% in 2019 to 140% now. And inflation is the big issue in Argentina, which is very different to here or in America for the reasons that we had Brexit or that we had Trump, for example. So he's an economist. But to listen to that Tucker Carlson interview and then compare that with the headlines we've seen from the BBC or the New York Times, where he is this far right candidate, you know, he's not far right actually. This is a man actually who's in favour of trans rights, who's actually in favour of drug legalization. This is the first libertarian president in the world who is very much anti-leftist, but he has a very libertarian view to many social issues, which I don't think the public is necessarily that aware of. He's also, of course, been criticised in the last couple of days for saying that Argentina has sovereignty over the Falkland Islands. But of course, that's akin to a British politician saying that they support the NHS. You have to say that in Argentina.
Yes.
He's actually a pro-Thatcherite. He's very much a Milton Friedman type of conservative. So he's actually not from that sort of populist right-wing wing that got Trump elected or that, for example, saw the Red Wall voting. He's very much for free markets. That's why he wants to legalize drugs and so forth, for example. But he wants to introduce to Argentina the sort of economic reforms that Thatcher brought into Britain when it was at not a similarly, but at a comparably bad position economically. But the idea that he is a sort of a far-right populist in the Trump style is not right. I would say he's closer to sort of Silvio Berlusconi, although to me he looks like Trevor Bannister, Mr. Lucas, and Are You Being Served? He has a dead ringer for that.
But also, the thing is, one of the reasons why I think people were surprised by him is he he absolutely did this. Well, it was kind of invigorating in a way, but he did this huge rant against the left, didn't he?
Yes,
With
he
that
did, yeah.
female presenter, and he was just trying to get a word in edgeways. But I thought that again, it was sort of refreshing.
Yeah, it
in a
was.
kind of, you sort of thought, no, surely that's the sort of thing that obviously the mainstream media are going to call, you know, populist and right wing, because he was kind of vulgar and because he is unstudied
And he appears with a chainsaw because,
Yes.
of course, he wants to cut all of the waste and cut all of these stupid quangos and these left-leaning institutions and departments. Of course, he looks crazy doing that, but I think that's why he got elected, right? He's a populist
Yes.
in that sense, and he knows how to play the social media game, but he's a much more sensible chap. Whether his reforms will work or not, he wants to dollarize the economy, which you can totally understand in the Argentinian context. But Argentina has very few dollars left in its reserves, so there's a lot of question as to whether what he actually is promising will be able to be delivered upon. But we can only hope so, because populism has, you know, ended in failure so often recently that it would be lovely to have an example where it actually works.
I mean, I think that a lot of our older viewers will actually know this more, but Argentina was the byword for sophistication not that long ago. I mean, until basically the post-war era. I mean, sophistication, huge prosperity. There used to be a saying, didn't there? He's as rich as an Argentinian.
Yeah. My family went to Argentina after the Second World War. They weren't German. They were.
Yes, I was going to say.
They were on the post.
Not Brazil then.
On the post, but they were landowners, and they were used to having estates, and they basically went to Argentina to do the same cattle management and all that sort of thing. And life there was the safest, most secure place in South and Central America. It was a Valhalla.
Yes.
And to see the decline, the rapid decline, you know, Buenos Aires was the Paris of South America.
Yes, exactly. These days, of course, it also has more polo clubs than anywhere, I think, in the world, including this country. Also, more shrinks, more therapists.
Right, okay. Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
You should go to
I
that,
didn't
you know.
know. I could do. Start off with
More than
business.
America.
Yeah. I mean, it does show how much economics affects voting, doesn't it? In that, you know, I can't imagine all the people of Argentina have suddenly become ideologically libertarian. I think they've just had enough with the hyperinflation, and they've voted for this guy. And perhaps that's what it would take for someone to get elected here. But I mean, it's interesting. The label of far right is it's just now applied to anybody that's popular, it seems, or anybody that's. I mean, in a sense, he's the opposite of far right, because he wants to abolish. I mean, they even call him. They call him. I saw one article they call him a far right dictator, but he wants to abolish government. So in what way is he a dictator? It just shows how our sort of media is so simplistic in the terms that they use.
You're quite right. It's all about the small state. He wants to lessen the state, which is not really a fascist sort of thing to do. But yeah, I mean, that's the reason he got elected, was really because the state had failed.
Yes.
The Peronist politics of decades long had bankrupted the country, and he came to power not on his own virtue, but because everything else had failed. And had there been another candidate, they may well have beaten him. I mean, the fact was that his competitor was the Minister of Finance, and it was only the fact that he was, similarly guilty of having trashed the economy, and that's one of the reasons he wasn't elected.
I think one of the most important things he says, which really struck me in that clip we just showed, I think it might not be in that clip, but one of the most important things he said was, you've got to make it a free fight with the culture war. And when it comes to the left, you have got to get a level field, a free fight and a fair fight. By that, and he said the way to do that is just simply to take away their money, because the left, as he put it, live off the money of other people. And I thought this was incredibly clarifying, because I was thinking of many of the things we discussed. We've got this book coming out shortly, which we'll tell you all about at another date. But essentially, there's a lot of it is about public funding as well of things that once you take away that basically it's insulation, isn't it, from the market? You can't keep arguing things and carry on. And he makes this point, doesn't he?
Yes, in a sense, the left are the establishment, or the elite, as Matt Goodwin always points out. They are the ones with the money. They don't have very good ideas, but they have the power and the money.
Yeah.
And
the means of communication, which is so important.
Exactly, yes. Speaking of that, I think there is there with this, we should have our now weekly Bush Tucker little episode. I think, how is Nigel doing? I don't know whether it's called Bush Tucker Diary or something they call it, I think. But have you watched any more of
No, I've never seen it, but I see a couple of clips on Twitter on Nigel Farage's thing, but I don't know what's going on.
You don't know what's
They're
going on?
similar. I've seen a few clips.
I think he's winning hearts and minds.
Well, yes.
Which is what I rather expected he would do.
Yes, they put him through these sort of tests where he had to eat testicles or anuses or something. I don't know, but I mean, he's apparently, he's being staunch and stoic. But there's another person who is being voted off, or looks likely to be voted off, not him. But people, I think the whole point is people will keep on voting him in so that he gets, to do all these terrible things.
But as I say, he's such a naturally charming and pleasant person who
Yes.
I've never had anyone personally have an ill word to say about him, and likewise, he's never spoken ill. That I think people who aren't rabidly left-wing or who really hate him, people who just may have a dislike towards him, may be pleasantly surprised by all of this.
Oh yes, actually that's the one
Yes.
thing. Yeah, he was naked. He was having a shower, so you could see his naked bum, apparently. So anyway, but that's Nigel for you. Anyway, thank you very, very much, Amy. Thanks, Ray. That's it for this week. See you next time, and in the meantime, I do hope you have a good week. Okay, take care. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.